Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session in our Reimagining Academia speaker series. So we have a five-part series planned, and so far we've done three, and this will be our fourth session. And it's hosted by the Office of the Vice Principal, Culture, Equity, and Inclusion here at Queen's University. Our topic for today is intersecting identities and mental health, culturally informed strategies for supporting marginalized students. Our speaker is Dr. Arunima Khanna, and our moderator is Jermaine Marshall in the HRU office at Queen's. Before we get into our presentation, and before I hand over to Jermaine, let us begin this session by acknowledging that Queen's University is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and engage in dialogue on these lands. As we explore the intersection of identity and mental health and consider culturally informed strategies for supporting marginalized students, we do so with humility and a commitment to honoring the voices and experiences of Indigenous peoples whose ways of knowing, healing, and community care continue to inform and enrich understandings of well-being. This acknowledgement serves not only as a recognition of the history of this land, but also as a call to reflect on our personal responsibilities in the ongoing work of reconciliation, equity, and inclusion in academic and mental health spaces.
Thank you so much for starting off our session so well, Tracy, and it's always great to see you. So I'll start off by just introducing Dr. Makana, which I feel like many of us have maybe intersected with already, interacted with. She's an amazing person here at Queen's University. She is a psychologist and she works as the cross-cultural counselor at Queen's University. She provides counseling and therapy to culturally diverse students, including racialized and international students, as well as training and workshops on multicultural competencies, cultural humility, and issues relating to diversity, equity, and anti-racism. Dr. Khanna also advises faculty, staff, student government, and groups, as well as administrators, on issues pertaining to the needs of students from diverse cultural, racial, and ethnic backgrounds, again, including international students. Her services and work are grounded in a multicultural framework in which clients' issues are informed by the social and cultural contexts within which they live. To this end, she focuses on both individual and structural issues faced by clients, taking a strengths-based, social justice, and culturally informed approach to her work, which makes her the perfect sort of presenter for today's session on intersecting identities and mental health. Culturally informed strategies for supporting marginalized students as we seek to reimagine academia, how we move through it, and how we support students through it. Dr. Khanna, please take us away.
Thank you, Jermaine, and thank you, Tracy Ann. I'm really happy to be a part of this series. I've been working on the issues that Jermaine mentioned for most of my career at Queen's. And so I always welcome a chance to be able to share my observations, I hope with humility. I also want to just acknowledge that there's likely a lot of expertise on these issues, on this topic in this virtual room. So I just want to acknowledge, all the people who are attending this session. And I really look forward to your comments when we're doing the Q&A. Just to start out, I should acknowledge that I come into this from a mental health background. I'm a psychologist. And so obviously in my role, I tend to see students who are predominantly having more negative experiences. And I want us also to recognize that a lot of marginalized students are actually, for the most part, doing reasonably well, but there are a significant number who are struggling, and I think that is something of concern. Okay, so just very quickly, what are our reasons for really talking about this? And from my point of view, the more I've done this work, and I've said this to Jermaine several times, the more confused I get because, the social landscape is changing, the climate is changing. And so what I've really come to really focus a lot on are the more systemic and structural aspects of our experiences. And so because of that, I do want to say that we all have a role to play in creating a welcoming, inclusive, and equitable learning space for our students. it's not just about sending somebody who's having mental health issues to student wellness, but it's really for us to recognize that we all have a role to play. Also want to say that if you are interacting with students in any capacity, you are definitely going to be interacting with people who are having mental health challenges. So it's kind of important to really understand some of their experience and what would be helpful to them. Also, and again, this won't be a surprise to many of you, there's been a consistent increase in the number of students who are reporting mental health difficulties. Certainly at student wellness, our staff numbers have really grown over the years, but they don't seem to be enough. It's sometimes I'll say it's like a bottomless pit. You add resources, but the need keeps growing. And obviously, we should all be interested in wanting to contribute to the well-being of our students. And then the other point I want to make is that generally it will be peers or staff or faculty who will be the first to notice if something is off with a student. We're generally not the first people, right? Because we're the ones who see them once they're in distress. So that's why it's kind of important for us to be all involved in creating, a healthy kind of climate for our students. Just again, we all know this, but mental health is strongly related to academic performance and retention of students. It's related to timely completion, people spending less on student debt. And from our end, and this is something I'm very passionate about, I'm more interested in prevention of difficulties and early identification of difficulties so we can intervene before things get progressively worse. And the outcome is generally better if we could do that. So, okay, I thought it kind of made sense. Again, just take a minute or so just to talk about mental health. Like, what do we mean by that? And most of us in this field tend to rely on the World Health Organization's definition of it. Excuse me, I do have allergies, so please excuse me. So it's basically a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well and work well, and contribute to their community. So it's kind of important to note that this definition really emphasizes a positive dimension to mental health. It's not just an absence of ill health, it's a positive thing. So what this really means is that one is productive, that we're able to do our work or do our academic work as students, that we have fulfilling relationships. And this is really, really important from a mental health point of view because there is a lot of evidence, this is a very well-established fact now, that people need real-life human contact and love in some ways to flourish, right? Social connection and community is important for our well-being. It gives us meaning, it gives us purpose, and that's what we need to thrive. So this is a really important part of this definition. The other piece is having the ability to adapt and cope with the ups and downs of life. So the downs of life are a fact of life. No one's going to have a life without those. And so for us to be able to manage these and to be able to, ride the wave when we're hitting a low period, and most importantly, that we're thriving. So it's not that we're just existing, but we're actually flourishing, we're thriving. We have a sense of satisfaction, we're enjoying life, we're contributing to life, and we're generally feeling good. Okay, so just the flip side of it, mental health difficulties. Typically, they occur when a person's distress or the environmental demands or stressors overwhelm their coping, which then affects their daily functioning and performance of things that they need to be doing on a day-to-day basis. In the mental health field, we call this an interaction between diathesis and stress. So diathesis are genetic vulnerabilities that we all have, unique aspects of who we are biologically. Some of us are more sensitive, more prone to getting stressed, but it really is the interaction with the environment and situational factors and stressors and demands placed on us that can tip us into mental health difficulties. Okay, just very quickly then again, what are the determinants of mental health? And again, I know that some of you know this already. It really is not a straightforward thing. There's many individual, social, structural, systemic factors that combine to protect our mental health or to undermine it. So throughout our lives, these factors combine to either contribute to good mental health or position us into less good mental health. So the individual biological and psychological factors would be, things like our genetics, the kind of lifestyle we're leading, our sense of self, how we see ourselves, and the kind of coping and emotion regulation skills that we possess that we can deploy when we need them. The social, structural, and systemic factors are really the environment within which we are living. Whether is it favorable to us? Is it unfavorable? What are our family circumstances? What are our socioeconomic circumstances? Are we included? Are we excluded? Are we marginalized? Do we have a sense of connection and belonging? What are the quality of social interactions that we're experiencing, or what is the quality of social interactions that we're experiencing? Do we have emotional, physical safety? So these are the kind of social, structural, systemic factors that can either contribute to good mental health or to undermine, depending on which direction they are operating in. Okay, so just again, very briefly, I'm combining like a lot of research that has looked at student mental health. Just for your interest, the study of student mental health really started at Oxford University right after, I think, the Second World War, when a lot of students came back after fighting the war and were reporting, a lot of mental health difficulties. And there was a family physician working at Oxford who then wrote a little article and said, being a student is an occupational hazard. And sometimes it really feels that way. So anyway, there is a big body of literature, and just summarizing it very, very briefly, what are the risk factors? Not surprisingly, financial issues top this list. The cost of living, financial insecurity, and precarity are right up there. Workload pressures, so academic difficulties, is there lots to do? Are people not able to cope and keep up? For graduate students, what's the relationship like with their supervisors? A poor relationship is strongly associated with poor mental health. Feeling invisible, and international students, actually, for them, this is their second most highest stressor, feeling invisible. Like people just walk on around them as if they don't exist. Feeling very different, again, for students who are international students or students who've come from really big, diverse, cosmopolitan cities, all of a sudden start feeling very different from their peers. That can be a risk factor. Lack of belongingness, so feeling like you're not connected. Lack of social connectedness and community. So I'm noticing that as colleges, universities, and as a society, we seem to have completely embraced high-tech and budget-based plans for how to deliver courses. And because of this, I think what we've ended up with is a very low-contact learning space. I've been noticing for the last, I would say, 8 years or so, students don't even know the names of their professors. They're taking their class, but they don't even know the name of their professors. They don't know names of their peers or even their group partners with whom they've done a group project, right? So it makes me wonder, what is that saying about student-to-student relationships, student-to-professor relationships, and general student engagement? And I do see this as a risk factor for mental health difficulties. Loneliness, again, there's a huge body of literature that loneliness is a huge, huge, huge risk factor for mental health and well-being. Lack of social support, again, we're less connected. In some ways, this is a very connected generation because of technology, but in terms of real meaningful connection, things have been sort of going downhill and there is less social support. For minoritized students, there are other unique sort of needs based on their connectedness. So the factors that I've listed are actually even more prevalent for these students. We've been noticing in the counseling office, students have been coming to us, and the kinds of issues they've been talking about are feeling excluded or marginalized by their peers, experiences of microaggressions and invalidations, often from good, well-intentioned people, often not feeling confident and comfortable in the classroom, loneliness, as I mentioned. All these experiences, from a mental health point of view, can erode one's sense of self, one's confidence, and our ability to thrive. And I also want to highlight that it's a small group, but we've been getting students who are coming to Queen's as refugees or students from very disadvantaged backgrounds from global South countries and from Canada who are coming to Queen's on a scholarship of some kind. And I just want to say that, again, their needs are even more unique and, complicated. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that. Okay, what protects us in terms of developing mental health problems? First is if you come to college or university with what I call a good pre-entry self-esteem, feeling reasonably confident, with a reasonably well-developed sense of identity, we kind of know who we are, that's really helpful. I'm actually a former international student, and fortunately for me, I think when I came to Queen's, my sense of self was reasonably established, and I was able to, whatever invalidations or microaggressions I experienced, I was able to be a bit of somebody who was like, where it was like, water running off a duck's back kind of situation. But I've certainly seen through my clients and friends that sometimes these barbs or these unintended microaggressions really stick and they can affect us. So that good pre-entry self-esteem really helps. Having community and connection. So you could be, for example, the only Black student on your floor in residence, but if you've connected with a group of people, right, that's a huge protective factor. If you have a group of fellow students who are very friendly and open to including people, that's a protective factor. Having some agency to exercise some control in response to stresses. So if we feel that there's something we can do to mitigate the harm, to reduce the impact on us, that protects us from developing mental health issues. Having access to resources that allows us to make choices, what are my options? What can I do in this situation? That's a protective factor. Support from family, friends, advisors, supervisors, healthcare providers, student services. Again, those are protective factors because it makes us feel someone's got our back, somebody understands, and someone's there for us. Slight caveat about family factors. Families can also be, they're generally protective, but they can also be risk factors depending on family expectations, a family situation. If I'm thinking of like graduate students with families where, they've got like full-time lab work and TA responsibilities, and yet they've got a partner and young children to look after. So family can work both ways. It can reduce loneliness, but it can also add to the demands on a student. And then, of course, if we have a college or university climate that is culturally humble, competent, culturally informed, that's a huge protective factor. Okay, So on to now social identities. Basically, intersecting rather aspects of our social identities inform our experiences. So what do I mean by social identities? It's a sense of self that we have based on who we are, how we identify, what our values are, what's important to us. And this is informed by our genetics, where we've come from, where we're living, who our peer group are, what the historical factors of our community are, etc. So typically, and I know you know this, there's all these domains of culture and domains of social identity. Um, typically, the categories of these domains or aspects of social identity tend to vary from person to person and depends on their context. So it's really hard to have a definitive list for these reasons. So what's most important to know is how these aspects of our social identity combine to determine how we're impacted by whatever situation we're in. So while I'm talking about social identity aspects such as race, racial identity, ethnicity, being an indigenous person, our nationality, our status, are we immigrants or refugees, our socioeconomic situation, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, abilities, perceived abilities, languages that we speak, our education, age. This is not an exhaustive list, but what's important to know is that these overlap with one another and systems of power to either oppress us or to result in some disadvantage or to advantage people in various contexts. So it's about the aspects of our social identity which can either increase our privilege, access to opportunities, good things, or it can expose us to disadvantages. So what I'm saying is that this list that I have that's not exhaustive, but what the important thing is to know that these intersect, and basically it's not okay to just focus on one aspect of a person's identity without considering other aspects. So it's all about intersectionality. So for example, let's say there is a first-year international student who is experiencing a lot of anxiety and low mood. Now, to fully understand their experience, you would need to also attend to factors such as, let's say, gender, racial, ethnic background, for the language they're most comfortable speaking, because all these will, are they connected to community? Are they, what's their nationality? They come from a global north, a global south country. That's what's going to give you some sense of how to conceptualize their experience and to figure out what would be most helpful for them. I'm thinking of some situations. We had some Indigenous students at Queen's who came from a very remote community where they had not had access to a lot of technology. And we had actually a similar experience with some students who came from a global south country where the very first time they owned a laptop was when they arrived at Queen's. Prior to that, there was a shared desktop in their high school that they had limited access to. And so when they were in class, we expect a certain amount of familiarity with technology and expertise in that area. They were experiencing a lot of anxiety, right? So in order to really conceptualize what's going to help these students, we need to be able to look at those intersecting aspects of their social identity. And what they needed was not so much seeing the therapist, what they needed was some practical support, right? Okay. All right. So important to always remember that social identities are complex. There are multiple and differing dimensions to our identity, these intersect and mediate in complex ways to shape our behavior and our experiences. So some aspects of our social identities are obvious and clear by, let's say, by my name and how I look. I think it's pretty clear that I'm of South Asian background. And so it's generally our visible characteristics that give a sense of, which are the obvious and clear parts of our identity. But some aspects of our social identities are not obvious and clear. So somebody's ability/disability or somebody's sexual orientation, if they're not publicly out, somebody who is struggling financially but is able to, not show that on the surface. But these aspects may not be obvious and clear. You could have a racialized person who grew up in a predominantly white community. And so their social identity might be quite different, right? So they may not necessarily identify with their group. So some identities are self-claimed based on our peer group where we've grown up. And it's interesting, I had a student who came from Toronto, and he was actually my second client at Queen's. And he was a real mover and shaker in high school in Toronto, very popular kid, Filipino Canadian background. And at Queen's, he was very isolated, and everyone kept asking him, where are you from? Where are you from? And assumed that he was an international student. And this completely derailed his confidence and sense of self. Not that I'm saying being an international student is a bad thing, but definitely those comments made him doubt who he was. And he was a child born very late to his much, much older parents, and his siblings were very much older than him. So there was a huge culture gap between him and his family. And so he very much identified in a way in which he was not received at Queen's, right? So we also claim identities. But identities are also ascribed or conferred by others, as I mentioned in this example. And I'll give you a personal one, where even those of us who work in this field and give workshops on it can make these mistakes. I was told that there was a neighbor in our condominium building that was arriving from Saudi Arabia. And I was told that they were coming to do some fellowship and some, very prestigious medical kind of capacity. And I decided that I was going to, be an inclusive, equitable, good person. So I thought, I'm going to go introduce myself to this couple who've arrived from Saudi Arabia with their two little toddlers. And guess who I thought the doctor was? I thought it was the man. It was the woman, right? So sometimes we confer identities on people. So we need to watch out. Okay. Again, parts of our identity that capture attention are those that others notice more and reflect back to us. So one thing that I've heard from international students, they'll say, like, what do you mean I'm racialized? Where I'm from, everyone looks like me. So what do you mean, right? But when you come into an environment where you minoritize, that's reflected back to you, right? So then that becomes a more salient part of one's identity. This can often set us apart as different or as the other. So it is a fact that people do get defined on the basis of their race, ethnicity, gender expression, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, age, physical or mental ability. Each of these has an ism, has a system of oppression associated with this. It's important to note that some of us, or most of us rather, can be both dominant and targeted at the same time. And even there's research to show that even people of color can commit microaggressions and hold bias and, prejudicial views against other POCs. Okay. So again, the key is the more the factors of social identity that are showing up in a situation, the greater the impact or the experience. Okay, so just to illustrate this point, I've created a composite of a student based on things that I've observed in my practice. So please don't try to identify who this might be. If any of you think you might know such a person, that's simply not going to be the case. So let's look at student S, 26-year-old POC woman. What do we see on the surface? We see sort of roughly her age. She's POC, female presenting. What we've seen is she's a competent student, but what we've noticed is she's often late in meeting her deadlines, which is quite frustrating for her supervisor. We also see on the surface that she tends to keep to herself in this environment of predominantly white peers in her lab. What we sort of see by some mentions that she makes is that she's a single parent to a young child. There seem to be some financial pressures. She seems to be really worried about funding all the time. She often seems to require a leave of absence or absences from her research work due to needing, because her child is sick or she's not well. And she seems isolated in the lab. Now, what we don't see about her is that she's separated from her husband because she's not shared this. She has no child support because it was a very unhealthy situation. She also has no support from her family due to shame and stigma of divorce. She has no social support in her life, nothing in her community, not from her peers, and she feels very out of place among her peers. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that aspects of our social identity are not immediately obvious and clear. And it's important for us to recognize and to remember that students have lives outside of academics and that their experiences extend beyond academics, and that these aspects of their lives impact their academics. Okay, another example. Again, another composite. We have a 20-year-old Chinese-Canadian student, male student, bright but very shy and insecure. He's been generally pretty isolated, but recently has developed some friendships with classmates, who've been kind of kind, but now they're finding him to be really clingy and they're feeling harassed by him. So again, what we sort of see is a socially awkward person who doesn't seem to read social cues very well. He's polite and very apologetic when he senses that he has bothered people. What we don't see is his history of being bullied, lack of social connection. So he's very lonely and isolated. And this was the case through elementary, middle school, and when he first arrived at university. There are a lot of issues within the family. So the family are not supportive. Everyone is distressed and experiencing difficulties in their own way. And they often make comments that actually don't build him up. They often put him down. There's also, sorry, I meant not gender, but generation and culture gap between him and his parents. So they feel they don't really get it. They don't understand why he's struggling. He should be happy. He's in a place getting education. There's enough money for him to manage. What we also don't see is there's a diagnosis of autism and social and general anxiety. So again, if we are to look at this person, there are aspects of him that we don't always see, but which inform his experience and his behavior. Okay. So if it isn't already apparent, as you can see, my bias is really towards the environmental factors, the structural and systemic factors. We are definitely impacted by the social cultural context within which we live. And when we're looking at mental health difficulties, we need to situate them within those contexts. If we have to fully understand, what is the person's experience and what's the best way to addressing those difficulties. I also want to push environmental factors because emerging in early adulthood is a crucial time of identity development. So students, undergraduate students, and also probably graduate students are at a key developmental stage where there's a lot going on in their life. Their sense of self is developing. This is also a time where their racial identity or their identity as a queer person, or identity as somebody who's managing a disability, etc., is developing. Their comfort with who they are as a person is developing. When these processes are going on, people tend to make a lot of social comparisons. So with peers, right? And so these comparisons can be upward, as in, I'm not as good as this person, or I love the presentation style for this person. They seem so confident, or they're so attractive, and I'm not, right? So we make those upward social comparisons. Or we can do downward ones, which are, I'm better than these people, which is less common among the population we're talking about. So emerging in early adulthood is a really crucial time of development. Through these processes and social cultural experiences, we're getting a sense of who am I? How am I similar and different from my peers, my family, all the things that I just mentioned? Do I matter? Do I hold social capital? Who holds social capital on this campus? And am I one of those people? So if we're getting unhealthy messages based on our social identities, if there are microaggressions happening, these interfere with the process of developing a healthy social identity and a healthy sense of self. So that's why environmental factors are really, really important in terms of contributing to mental health difficulties, but also helping us get protection from them if we address those. Okay, so what are some of the impacts of being excluded, marginalized, discrimination, racism in social environments? Again, based on research, this is very well documented. A very common finding is feeling anxiety, insecurity, loss of confidence, often blaming ourselves for our bad experiences, feelings of shame and guilt. Heightened vigilance, so always being on alert. Am I doing things the way I'm supposed to be? Are people accepting me? Was that right? Or did I do something that's not okay? Now, a certain amount of watchful vigilance, as we like to call it, is protective, right? Like for minoritized people, for BIPOC people, for QT BIPOC people, a certain amount of watchful vigilance is very helpful because you are kind of making sure that things are okay for you. But if we are very vigilant, when the vigilance is heightened, it is disruptive because a lot of our emotional energy goes into trying to suss out, is everything safe? Am I okay? What's going to happen? Am I doing things that I'm supposed to, rather than doing the things that we're meant to be doing in that moment? These experiences can affect us at a cognitive level. So how we process information, our memory can get a little bit confused, again, because our mental energy is divided between that vigilance and the task that we're attending to. Low mood depression, suicidal ideation, feeling afraid in certain spaces, which could include in the classroom, feeling angry when you notice injustices, having difficulties interpersonally. Those are some other impacts. Physical health, mental health and physical health are interconnected. So some of the impacts can include feeling headaches, having sleep issues, hypertension, cardiac issues, addictions, and definitely a negative impact on academic performance and achievement. You won't believe how many students that we see who are experiencing some of these difficulties stop going to class after 1 or 2 weeks of term beginning. And they have completely disconnected because they are so down and depressed, not feeling good about themselves. So this is serious indeed. Okay. Other impacts include microaggressions, invalidations, being excluded, minoritized, can trigger memories of past personal or historical group trauma. So what I mean by that is if we've had like previous such incidents of exclusion, or the student that I talked about who was bullied in elementary school, when he experiences things in university, he's also reminded of those experiences that he had growing up. So these impacts are not just immediate impacts, they can also be accumulation of previous such incident, impacts of previous incidents that are similar, but also invoking historical group trauma. So let's say, when George Floyd was murdered, and that was actually 5 years ago, in May, on the 25th of May, it touched the Black community, the POC community, minoritized communities. So you can be cumulatively, and as a community, be affected by such experiences that are happening to an individual. Microaggressions are one of the big problems with them is that they convey a message about positionality. So who's at the top and who's at the bottom, right? Who holds social capital and who doesn't. So the more microaggressions, the more the message is, you don't belong here. This is not how we do things here. You need to change, or you need to be different in order to fit in. So that's often experienced as an attack on the sense of self, our personhood, our racial and cultural identities. These impacts are cumulative, as I mentioned, and can also be intergenerational. A lot of our Indigenous clients will tell us that. Indigenous students will tell us that they're not just dealing with what they're experiencing, but they're also dealing with the experiences of generations past and previous. Okay. The good news, some good news, that not everybody who experiences microaggressions develops severe stress reactions. If you recall, I have talked about protective factors. So it really depends on the level of threat, where they're at in terms of their racial identity development. If it's well established, they're less likely to be impacted. But if it's just fragile, they're more impacted. Their self-esteem is good. If they have social support and sense of belonging and community, they'll be less affected. Okay, so very quickly, because I'd like to leave room now, a time for discussion. How do people cope with discrimination due to marginalization? The first thing is, what is it? It's an individual coping style. Some people tend to personalize things. So when they are receiving discrimination, they internalize the negative messages and that experience. So the number of students that I see who've actually internalized some pretty toxic, racist, or inappropriate, incorrect messages about their social identity. So if people personalize it, that is not the best way of coping. But sometimes they challenge those, right? Internally. So they reappraise. They'll go, I'm not the problem. This other person is ignorant, right? Or I'm not the problem. I made a good presentation. I have good, it's not my problem if they couldn't get my accent, right? So they reappraise, and sometimes they fight back, and sometimes people do both. Often people seek social support from friends and community. But sometimes people try to acculturate, right? So they cope with discrimination by accommodating or catering to the majority, trying to be just like them, to do things just like them, to change names to fit in, to do things where they are seen as innocuous based on various aspects of their social identity. They appease people, they blend in, they reframe things for those people so that those people don't have to take responsibility for their microaggressions. Sometimes people cope by keeping to their own community and isolating. Often frustrates me when people will say, those Chinese kids, they just like to hang out with each other, right? We don't say that about other communities, right? We don't say that about white kids, and we say, why do they only like to talk to each other? But sometimes it's a preference, and nothing wrong with that. But sometimes it's the only community one can find. So sometimes people become activists and they join social justice movements like Idle No More, Black Lives Matter, Pride, etc. It's interesting, actually, sometimes when you see a first-year student as they advance through the university system, sometimes you see that as their racial identity is developing, they start identifying more with their identity as a queer person or as a Black or a POC person, and get more involved in social justice movements. Okay. So interventions for mental health, right? The first issue that stands in the way of people getting good mental health services can be a lack of culturally relevant and competent services. A lot of colleges and universities have been working on that, but we still have miles to go to really get there. But we're trying. But I also want to say that sometimes for a minoritized student, there's also the whole belief that they're not going to get culturally relevant or competent services. So if you're referring somebody, sometimes it's important to kind of encourage people to access those services, to at least try them out. There is a lack of comfort and trust in services. So this can be historical factors. I have clients whose parents actively discourage them from coming to counseling because they're afraid that somehow it'll damage their immigration status, or they won't be able to become citizens, or when they apply for PR, permanent residency status, they won't get accepted. There's also been, people who've historically, parents have had terrible experiences with the healthcare system, so they'll encourage their families to not go there either. So that could be another reason. There can be language barriers. When English is an additional language, typically what we work on is more, general functioning things. Emotional language is very personal. And so there can be a language barrier. There can be a barrier based on cultural values between the client and the therapist. Then there are systemic and structural issues. Again, it's not always about what's happening within a person. Of course, there's an impact, but it's really about an environment that's contributing to problems. So I think there's a real problem if we don't address the systemic societal causes for that mental health issue or that emotional distress. We have to remember this is not a level playing field for all our students, no matter how hard we try. We have to really work more at it. So if we simply just make this the individual's responsibility, that's not okay. We need to look at systemic factors that are contributing to why somebody who comes with good mental health to university or college then develops mental health issues. I also want to say that therapy and counseling is not the only way of healing. And we really need to honor the healing power of community and connection, that social connectedness, knowing you belong, that you've got community is huge. And I learned a really amazing lesson from a student that I worked with. She came from Khanna, and she actually came to see me at the end of her first year, after which she'd been required to withdraw from university due to poor academic performance. And she was looking for a letter of support to kind of be allowed to come back to university without taking that 1 year off. And although I hadn't seen her, her story was so convincing that I did give her that letter. And here's what impressed me. She said that she was so depressed, she was so isolated on campus. She basically spent all her time in her room, had no friends, nothing. And at the end of first year in the early part of the summer, she went home and her family arranged for her to see a more indigenous healer in her country and community. And she described her experience, and he said to her, "There's nothing wrong with you. The problem was you didn't have community. And you should not wait for community to come to you. You need to build that community. You need to seek that community, right?" And so that's what we worked on. And she was thriving after that. So therapy is not the only way, right? It's important that we get minoritized students who are having mental health issues connected with service providers as well, because we don't want them to suffer in silence, or we don't want things to get worse than they should be. And I've seen a number of refugee students who land in that sort of situation where they come here. They've never had any experience with a mental health service provider. They've sometimes had minimal health care, to be honest. And they're struggling here because they're trying to work at jobs to send money home to their families who are in refugee camps. They're really lost because sometimes they're not as prepared academically, having learned in a refugee school for first year studies here. And when they're struggling, they don't seek help. They just try, and sometimes that's not enough. And recently, I had a case where this one student who was finally connected to me, having just lost her scholarship and was going to be sent back home. And I'm like, why are you connecting her now, right? You just want me to help her accept this decision and go back. But what we should have really done was connect her when she was starting to have difficulties, and we could have had a different outcome. So, okay, so just wrapping up now, how can you support? The first thing is for all of us to strive for a stance of cultural humility and informed curiosity. Please remember, when we're working with minoritized students on various aspects of social identity, it's best to assume that those factors are always a factor in their experience and presenting issues. How do we support people? We get to know our students. If you're faculty, know who's in your class. If you're providing student services, get to know more about the issues of different groups and what they're struggling with and what's good for them and what's not so good for them. Convey interest, show that they matter, that they're not just invisible student numbers. Be mindful of complexity of intersecting social identities. Definitely no stereotyping, because stereotypes are always inaccurate. Work for prevention of mental health difficulties, create psychological safety. It's a given that minoritized students always have that radar of watchful vigilance on. They're often wondering if they're psychologically safe in your space. Will their dignity, their personhood be respected? So it's important to be able to create that psychological safety while still gently pushing them to grow and get outside of their comfort zone or protective zones and, develop and flourish. Work to build connection and community. That's a really hard one. I will say that's one that gets me stumped all the time. Like, how do you help somebody who's really isolated build connections? For those of you who have more direct contact with students in a classroom or in office spaces, what are the dynamics? Minoritized attend to whether they're being marginalized or isolated. Is there an expectation that they're responsible for connecting to others, right? It's always the minority that seems to be put in the position of trying to connect rather than others trying to connect with them. Are there issues with group work? So if any of you are faculty, like how are groups formed? It's best if they are diverse groups so everybody kind of feels more comfortable and also has different strengths that they can bring to the group work. Is there accent discrimination going on? So a student who's making a presentation is not and has an accent that is different from the mainstream accent here is worrying not just about their content, they're also feeling anxious about, their appearance, their accents. So there's all these other factors that sort of factor those in. How are my culture-based assumptions influencing my expectations and interactions with students? How do I judge competence? We've got this sort of, the student who can do slick PowerPoint presentations, give really confident presentations, answers questions all the time. Like, we judge competence that way. We need to have a broader metric that also includes reflective, quieter students. How does the background identity of my student influence their experience and learning? Who gets advantaged? Who gets left out? Equal treatment is not equal access and equal opportunity. I know the Human Rights Office has been sending this message, equality is not equity, but you'll be surprised that we still don't often get it, right? So with good reason, professors say, I want to treat everyone the same way. But just remember that equality is not always equity. We need to address microaggressions, inequities. It's everyone's business. And most importantly, how can we encourage students to cross those demographic boundaries? We don't want people in their silos based on aspects of their social identities. We want more integrated communities. Of course, everyone needs their own community for support as well, but we also need an integrated community. Okay. How do you address the conversation? Just remember that if people have been minoritized and have experienced discrimination, not everyone is comfortable discussing those experiences. Not everyone is able to even articulate those experiences or be aware of the negative impacts. And that's something that Jermaine and I often talk about, right? Like, sometimes it's really hard for people to even understand that actually what happened to them was discrimination, right? They're blaming themselves. And they're just internalizing those negative messages. So it's our duty and our task to really change the conversation there and help people look at the environment. For effective work, we should always be looking at intersectionality of identity. For students who are struggling, I'm going to end with that. The time to listen, empathize with a distressed student is a significant contribution that you make to students. Don't underestimate that. Keep a list of referral sources ready in your office to be able to connect people. And if your instincts are telling you that there's a serious cause for concern, please seek immediate assistance from us. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those really profound insights. There's a lot going on in my head, and you can stop sharing your screen now so we can get ourselves nice and on the screen. And if folks want to, turn on their cameras at any point in time to
Tracy,
engage in the
yeah,
conversation, do
okay.
feel free to do so. I know that we have one question already coming in. So we talked a bit about the community-based approach. We talked a lot about as well international students and students who may come from collectivist cultures. So a question has come in asking, do you have any recommendations for implementing community-based or collective models of care at Queen's, especially for students from collectivist cultures or marginalized communities?
Sorry, of therapies?
So it's framed as community-based or collective models of care. So maybe care will take us
Yes,
into like a broader arena
absolutely.
of not just looking at therapy, but perhaps
Yeah,
something I like to talk about is
yeah,
therapeutic networks.
absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting. I work with the Peer Support Center at Queen's, and they do some
Mhm.
amazing peer support work. And the message that I've been pushing with them is, because often it's students in distress who reach out to them. And I said to them, why don't you organize events where people can just drop in and connect with people, right? And then they build that comfort. And then, you might get some healing going on in that way. And I know that they're really open to that. I think the model really has to be, interest groups or people just coming together on the basis of issues that are important to them. I really don't like the idea of pathologizing distress that is as a result of structural and systemic issues. So really kind of building some, um, you know, having some groups or meetings or events where people come and talk about these, and then something grows organically from that into a group where people can talk about messages and how they dealt with this and what helps and what doesn't help. Yeah.
But you said something that's really interesting, I think. There is sometimes this tension between what can the administration do and then what can students actualize as well. And what is that balancing of students oftentimes needing that support from the administration to resource what they want to actualize? Because I look at my own experiences as an international student and everything costs money. So when you were talking about that piece around belonging and that as something that is an indicator of mental health, but also cost and the expense of that, I oftentimes say to people, belonging is expensive. Let's say
Mhm.
you're a student, I was once a Jamaican international student and I want to go to a party. I oftentimes joke that I would always be the one watching the bus schedule at like the house party because I'm like, oh, I can't Uber to the place afterwards. I need to take the bus. And so sometimes that can become an interesting barrier when you have folks that are on scholarships who are having to kind of navigate finances very differently, especially in an environment like Queens, which is oftentimes known for having students with more purchasing power, let's say, than oftentimes
Mhm.
other university environments. And so, how does that conversation around belonging and mental health also take into consideration the financial cost to belonging, how much it takes to be able to
Yeah,
go to some of the events? To get venue space, that's another big barrier I find here at Queens,
yeah,
is that even when the students do come together to say we want to do something, are there
yeah,
spaces that they can access either on or off campus? Do they have the resources necessary to do that?
yeah.
Sorry, I don't know if you have anything you want to say before I open up for another question.
No, no, no. No, I think you raise really important points. And I think, having been involved in the whole diversity inclusivity piece for a long, long, long time, um, when we first started, our hope was really it was going to happen more at a grassroots community level where we would raise awareness among students. I think of a high table that I was invited at in residence, and it was like a U-shaped formation. And when I walked, and this was on an international and indigenous floor, and when I walked in, just half of this U was there were a couple of indigenous students and then white presenting students. And so conversationally, I said, "What's going on?" The other half is all empty, and some of the students said, "Oh, it's those international students. They don't like to join in. They never come for anything. We try to connect and they don't." And I was floored. I was like, so I said to them, "Do you want to hear what they say?" And they say you have no interest in getting to know them and that you don't include them. And it was interesting. There was a student who was listening, a white student who was listening, and she was kind of getting red in the face. And I'm thinking, oh, she hates me. She disagrees. And then she floored me by saying, I thought about what she said, and it's not good enough for us to just not, just try a little. We need to try harder. So I think for me, that sort of sense of belonging has to come peer to peer because all, students, and Jenny, you worked on your academic success survey. What we found, the microaggression students reported were more from peers in the classroom, right? So what can we do to create that belonging? Like I do agree, finances are always an issue, but I'd like to think that if we can raise more grassroots awareness and make it everyone's sort of responsibility to have this integrated, connected community. That's the way we need to go. And
And
the
I
trouble
think,
is that our class sizes are getting bigger and bigger.
mm,
Where we've noticed a change where minoritized students feel really good in the classroom are those classes where class size is smaller, they're more comfortable speaking, they actually connect with people. So as universities kind of, work with financial constraints, I think one unintended effect is that we're getting a more disengaged and less integrated student community, and that's bad for sense of belonging and connection.
And if I could layer a bit, and again, if folks have any questions, do feel free to raise your hand virtually by clicking the reaction on the dashboard that will give you the option to raise your hand or put something in the chat or click on the Q&A. But when you talk about those barriers to, I guess, peer-to-peer connectivity, I oftentimes think about it takes resources and energy, like personal energy, to navigate difference, to meet someone who is not like you and not jump to assumptions, negative, etc., and to take the time out of your day to meet someone new. And
Yeah.
what I find a lot of the times will happen is we're living in a society where for I want to say 20 years. The last 20 years, with the advent of technology and the internet and the ability to create very, very personalized echo chambers of these people are all like me already. You know, folks get really used to this kind of experience of just being around people who are so the same to them that they end up replicating those
Mhm.
patterns of connection when they get to university. They seek out sameness. And so part of what I oftentimes wonder is what does it look like for us as a university to not only promote diversity, but reward engagement with diversity on the student peer-to-peer level.
Yeah.
Design, again, classroom structure, AMS structure, cultural celebration structure, homecoming structures, all of these structures to literally be designed intentionally to get people to interact outside of their comfort zone, outside of their zones of sameness, while also equipping the university students with the skill sets to navigate that difference. Because I sometimes think about how one of the things about minoritized students is that we don't have the luxury of not engaging with everyone else. Because, for instance, when I was an international student, I spent a semester in New Brunswick at Ludlow Hall, finishing up my Bachelor's of Law degree, and I was the only Black male student in the environment. And so I literally couldn't only find people who were exactly like me, I had to engage with difference. But what
Mhm.
happens when you don't have to engage with difference? When you just kind of are able to only meet the people who are like you, none of your infrastructures, none of your classrooms, none of the club activities
Mhm.
actually put you in that sort of situation. I've sometimes spoken with diverse student clubs that have said, oh, you know, we'd love to interact with other student groups, but
Yeah.
they never come to our things. It feels as though they think it's only for us, or there's something that gets lost there
Yeah.
where, and
Yeah.
then sometimes, again, going back to that venue piece, sometimes the venue and environments we can get are so out of the way from the mainstream university
True.
environments that
Yeah.
it further adds that barrier of, oh, why would we go to this club's thing when we can go to this other club's thing that gets the prime spotlight kind of environment, if that kind of makes sense, if I'm
Yeah.
threading that comprehensively.
Absolutely. Well said, Jermaine. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I
Mhm.
was on what was called the DARE Commission, so Diversity,
Yes.
Anti-Racism and Equity Commission, where we, for those of you who've been here at Queen's for quite a long time, will know that there was huge numbers of town halls and individual meetings with students, staff, faculty about diversity, equity, and anti-racism kind of related issues or racism issues rather. And one thing that didn't make one sort of theme, because I was the one sort of mental health psychologist kind of person on the commission, I picked up on the fact that we had a lot of white students and white student leaders even saying, I want to connect with others, but I'm so afraid of saying the wrong thing. So I just ignore them, so I just don't include them. I just stay out of their way. And this was such a consistent theme. And I wanted this to be in our recommendation. Like, what can we do to address that, right? So what you've said is very well said, Jermaine. I completely agree. Um, you know, as the university is becoming high tech, it's becoming low contact. And this is not a criticism of Queens. I mean, this is just generally happening everywhere. What do we do to, bring that connection? And that's how people's attitudes change, and that's how people's perspectives broaden, right, about other groups.
So and again, just opening up the floor if at any point in time folks have additional questions. I'll say this and then we'll jump to Colleen's question, but you've identified a barrier there, the barrier of fear and anxiety, which, we're noticing there, it's shared amongst the non-racialized students and the racialized students of, I am afraid in these environments where I have to be hypervigilant.
Yeah.
both were kind of reflecting a level of vigilance about
Yeah.
different things. And so the easy thing to do is non-engagement. And the thing that our current sort of setup and institutional sort of arrangement sort of fosters, notwithstanding the Yellow House, which I think I already put that into the chat, the Yellow House, the Peer Support Network, and some of those student initiatives out of student wellness that are, I think, trying very hard to create those intentional communities. But when faced with these anxieties and fears, people choose not to engage. And so I wonder again, what does it look like at an organizational level, at a university level, to create a culture very intentionally, whether it's a campaign about navigating fear and discomfort? Because
Mhm.
when we talk about navigating difference, it's also about navigating the inherent conflict and tension that arises with difference. Because if everybody were the same, then we wouldn't have issues. But
Yeah.
because we are all different, conflict and tension is inherent in difference. So how do we, again, as a campus, equip incoming and longstanding students to say, hey, yes, you're going to make mistakes. Mistakes aren't the end of the world. Let's talk about how we as a campus respond to those mistakes. How do we equip you to maybe try to avoid them, etc. But Colleen, please jump in.
Mhm.
Thank
Like when I was a student, I haven't seen this that much. Like you would have, public address at Grant Hall. So they'd bring in some big speakers and everyone would go, and we would listen to this, like those kind of inspirational lectures or, leaders, community leaders who can come and really also, galvanize things. One of my favorite things was, sorry, Colleen, I don't want to hear from you, but uh, was a story from that I read in the journal, and was a young man called Ian Babbitt who wrote it. So he was journal staff, and there was an event on campus. It was the first Black AMS, former AMS president, but the first Black AMS president who'd been invited by a group to speak at Queen's. And I guess somebody was supposed to take photos and they were sick. So Ian was sent to take these photos. He wouldn't have gone for the event otherwise. And what he heard Frankson say, um, the trouble with, with universities is that it's not an integrated community. Everyone's sticking to their own community and not engaging. And Ian was so affected by that he actually wrote an article in the journal and said he'd made it now a point to try and connect across difference, right? So anyway, I mean, just related to space, extending what you're saying, I completely agree that we need those spaces. And, I think we also need more intercultural spaces. But one change that I've noticed, as I said, I was an international student, and my first year was one of the loneliest years of my life. And I've always seen myself as an introvert, but I was like, oh my God, I'm craving conversation. Um, and, what was really helpful was, so I was in psychology, I would hang around Humphrey Hall because all my classes were in Humphrey Hall. And so, you would pass people in the hallways, and so you would smile at them, and they slowly, connection would build. But now, we've got this model where classrooms are distributed all over campus. So, I could have one class in in Humphrey Hall, one in, I don't know, some other place, and so people go to class, they pack up and they leave. Like I think it's also structurally, we could be doing better. We could have spaces where people hang out, right? Based on their disciplines and that kind of thing as well, like more of those.
I want to jump into something, well, not controversial, but I think something that is an ongoing conversation globally, nationally, culturally about the internet and the question of being virtual or being present. Because you pointed out something, Arunima, earlier during your presentation about kind of a lot of the benefits of being able to do a lot of online learning and internet and Zoom workshops and sort of Zoom seminars, but it also has led to a situation where we're not seeing each other as much, where that capacity to build in-person interactions isn't happening. And I oftentimes have joked that, in Kingston, when I first moved to Kingston, sort of pulling from an sort of employee standpoint, but also reflective of, I think, some student experiences. A lot of the time when I'd say, oh, I'd love to do something, or, do a weekend activity, it was, oh, I won't be here. I'll be in Toronto, or I'll be in Ottawa, or I'll be in Quebec. And it's something that I've also heard some students talk about, this idea of people who are here almost only to do the academics and then they kind of leave, or even when they're here, they're always online talking sort of in a virtual headspace. And it's something that I've really been reflecting on, this idea of being present in the place that you're at and building community and belonging and connections here at a
Yeah.
time where the internet and, the online web wants to monopolize all of your attention, where if you're not careful, you can end up spending quite a lot of time just not leaving
Mhm.
your laptop or your cell
Yeah.
phone device and not really, even walking around Kingston. I've had some conversations about how to better bridge the activities going on in Kingston as an opportunity for students who maybe they're not as interested in making friends in the university, but maybe they're interested in branching out to the wider city. And so I sometimes think about this idea of how do we as a universe, as a center of learning, as the culture is changing. You mentioned earlier that being able to respond to changes is one of the signatories of good mental health. So how do we as a university cultivate good mental health by having campus-wide conversations about, we know everyone loves the internet and being online all the time, but let's talk about Queens as a campus where we're present. And what does that mean? How do we as Queens kind of take that leadership position in talking to our students, especially our undergrad students, especially upcoming generations that are so used to being online all the time, to say, hey, if belonging is something that you want, we're happy to help foster that. But you also maybe need to put down, I feel like I sound,
Yeah.
so what's the word? I sound like the okay boomer, but really actually having that difficult conversation where some people may roll their eyes, but I think a lot of folks would resonate with it, because you also see a lot of these platforms doing things like, oh, meet in person now, and oh, build friends in the area around you. I know that's a
Yeah.
bit of a jumbled thought, but and some may think, well, the university isn't a friendship making machine. Why should this be the university's prerogative? But if we're seeing the negative effects of this on the mental health of students, that's then affecting the academics, that's then affecting, them here at Queens. Is it increasingly becoming our responsibility, potentially, could an argument be made that we should be helping to foster those kinds of social connectivities in person, present here, Queens and Kingston? But that's a dense
I
thought that I just threw out there.
I think it is our responsibility. I think it is part of what we do because it's the extracurricular piece, right? So, I mean, the extracurricular learning, the extracurricular personal development, we're also raising citizens for the future kind of thing, right? So, I mean, if it's a pure business model of, here's a class, you attend this, here's an exam, here are these assignments, and then you get your degree, like, what's the point, right? In my opinion. I think if I had to reimagine academia, first of all, I would be imagining smaller classes, small class size is key, where you're engaged, where like I mentioned earlier, I'm always shocked when students don't even know the name of the professor whose class they're attending for 8 months. And they'll say, oh, I don't know. So to me, I think smaller classes where you actually learn and connect. But to your point about, online learning, like I'm not against it. I think it has its value, especially for certain students with certain challenges, And we know research has already shown us that during the pandemic, some BIPOC students actually had better mental health, on a virtual in a virtual situation, but that was also intersectional because if they had parents who couldn't help them with homework or they had poor internet connectivity, or not the
Or unsafe
resources.
home environments.
Yeah, so, it's all about balance, I think. But if I had to reimagine the academy, I'd say smaller class sizes, more
I
engagement.
I want to. I think we have about eight more. Is it 8 more minutes before? I'm unsure when this, if this closes at 1:30. Tracy, is that correct?
Yes, we were
So we have about 8 more minutes. If there were any final questions before I potentially throw another thought into the pool. Any other questions? Any other sort of ideas that are percolating in folks' minds? Um, Feel free to jump up at any time, pop in. Because I wanted to go back to the marginalized experience of students component to things, and something you said about the role that we all have to play, and that one example you gave of, and it's a shared experience that I've also had, where when somebody gets to our office as a resource in a situation of either harassment or discrimination, or again, the impacts of being, the only one in their class or etc., I oftentimes do think, oh, how did you not get to us before? How is it that you're being referred at this point? Oh my goodness, I wish you had come sooner. And so I wonder, what do you think about what does it look like for, again, us to have that conversation about how do we support marginalized students in understanding that they can ask for help, in building that trust relationship? Because you said quite a bit about how oftentimes for these communities, part of why they don't reach out for either mental health supports through a
Yeah.
therapist lens, or they won't think about, therapeutic networks. I oftentimes like to say that can involve spiritual therapeutic
Mhm.
networks or social therapy or even hobby-based therapeutic networks. They're not thinking about it like that. How do we get them to think about it like that? How do we support them in thinking, starting to think about it like that, and then either reaching out for help sooner or
Mhm.
having staff, faculty, and other peers who can help them reach out for it sooner, if that kind of makes sense for these marginalized
Yeah.
students.
I mean, I noticed that, a lot of,
Mhm.
faculty, will put out like a slide on resources and it's somewhere embedded in on cue. I
Mhm.
wonder if this has to be
Buried.
like an ongoing thing through the term, right? So sort of raise that awareness on an ongoing basis. Same thing in residence, being a little bit like the messaging, I think, has to be right from like an ongoing message, not a we've now told you once. So you should remember, or the assumption that they will know that there's a resource available because there's
Yeah.
so much sent to students, right? Like they're
Oh my
lost. I mean,
goodness.
so I think that's part of it
Mhm.
that I think makes it hard for people to access support when they need it.
I think
Um,
there really is a we've told you once culture sometimes in organizations where it's like, oh, but we gave it to you in the first orientation thing. How did you not know
yeah,
to use it 6 months later when you were feeling lonely? We already told you
yeah,
about it, as opposed to what you're saying, I think, almost an ongoing curriculum of, are you feeling lonely? Are you such and
yeah,
such? Be reminded that this is here for you
yeah.
if you want to reach out, if you get to a point where you want to reach out, because to your point about, I guess, culturally informed therapeutic supports, if you're engaging with a population that may hear it the first time and kind of be like, oh, I'm not lonely, oh, I don't think I'll need this, I'm fine.
Yeah,
And then later ends up in a spot where that is what they're feeling, but they don't
yeah,
remember all of that back there, and nobody's gonna bring it back up until the next big
yeah,
orientation thing.
yeah. I mean, I think like one thing that I forgot to mention earlier was if you are referring somebody, like it really helps, even if you were to say, I know you're going through a lot and validate those systemic challenges that they're experiencing. But then after that, maybe saying, I know someone who might be able to help with this. I would love to connect you with this person. So that personalized thing. But just sort of expanding on this, I think the biggest challenge that I'm finding is how do we transform awareness to action? I think there's a big gap there. Like, before we started this session, some of us were talking about this, and we do all these cultural competency workshops. There's all sorts of amazing kind of workshops happening on campus, and great manuscripts on how to do this or that. But students are saying they're not seeing a lot of change in terms of their lived experiences, right? So what's the missing piece? Like, how do we move from what they call left wing, how do we move from being a left wing racist to an anti-racist person? Left wing being you kind of say, yes, it's terrible to do these things and that's racism, but it doesn't, our behavior remains the same, right? So to me,
And
that's a
as
big challenge, right? You can have campaigns, but then how do you get people? And I think that's where I feel that connection, that one-on-one interaction is really key.
Yeah. And so in closing, I want to highlight something that Kate Brothers just put in the chat around sort of feeling obligated to highlight, to jump in and highlight that online spaces are crucial sites of community for disabled people, and that they
Yes.
don't think it should be an either or situation. Hybrid supports and programming is daunting for a lot of folks, but it can be well done. And I really do agree with that. I think
Yeah.
part of why I raised the point earlier about some of the pros and cons of the impact of online and the internet on our learning environment isn't to say that it should be an either or, because I'm a big
Yeah.
proponent of hybridize and kind of finding, I know this word gets used a lot, but the balance, part of equity is trying to find a balance between what different communities need at what points in time, in what environments, and in what contexts. And I think I agree 100% that it's about figuring out what that particular formula looks like of the hybrid supports that can provide each student with what they need to engage in the learning environment well, to engage in the social environment well. But and I think it's a challenge. I think that's the challenge that we're talking about. How do
Yeah.
we find that balance? How do we provide what students need at those various points in their academic career and academic trajectory, without necessarily going down a, oh, only one or only the other, because we know that that
Yeah.
model doesn't work and it's not
Yeah.
effective, or it will only help some people but not all. Okay, and
Exactly.
thanks so much for raising that again, Kate,
Yeah.
and really highlighting the relevance of those online spaces for disabled communities. So
Absolutely.
that being
Yeah, we
said, we are at
agree.
our last minute. So I want to thank Dr. Khanna for really stimulating my mind for sure. I'll have a million thoughts that I'll be thinking for the next couple of days. I hope folks got a lot out of the conversation. Do feel free to, make plans to come to the fifth. I don't know if Tracy, do you have a date for the fifth one yet that you wanted to maybe give a sneak peek or
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan and Jermaine, for a wonderful session. Our next and our final session will be on June 19th with Dr. Andrew Campbell. We're looking at pride in practice, how to embed LGBTQ plus practices into academia. And so I'm inviting everyone to come out and join us again for what should be a very inspiring and wonderful session. Thank you, everyone, for being here.